I have presided over countless cases in my years on the bench. I have watched men of power crumble. I have seen the desperate cling to truth like it was their final breath. But the day he walked into my courtroom, that day carried a different weight, a suffocating heaviness that settled into my chest before a single word was spoken. And I remember it with disturbing clarity, the polished marble floor reflecting the slow, arrogant stride of a young man who believed the world beneath his shoes existed solely for his comfort, his tailored suit, midnight black, stitched with the kind of precision only obscene wealth can purchase, hugging his frame like armor, his wrist glinting with a watch that likely cost more than the annual salary of every clerk in that room combined. And yet it wasn't the money that struck me. No, it was the look in his eyes, that empty, careless superiority, the kind I've come to recognize as the prelude to cruelty. I watched him as he approached the defense table, not with humility, not with caution, but with a smirk that bordered on mockery, his chin slightly raised, his gaze drifting lazily across the courtroom as if he were inspecting something beneath him. And I felt it then, that familiar tightening in my jaw, the silent warning bell in my mind, because I have seen this before, too many times. Young men raised without consequence, shielded by wealth, insulated from reality, convinced that laws are merely inconveniences meant for lesser people. And when his chair scraped loudly against the floor as he sat without waiting for instruction, the sound echoed sharply, disrespectfully, slicing through the room's already fragile patience. In my courtroom, silence is not just expected, it is respected, it is earned. And when that silence is broken with arrogance, I take note. I always take note. And as I adjusted the file before me, thick, heavy, filled with pages that seemed to carry more than just ink, I allowed my eyes to linger on his name, letting it settle in my mind, letting it breathe, because names like his come with history, influence, power, and sometimes protection. And I knew before I even opened the first page that this would not be a simple proceeding. This would be a battle, not of law alone, but of truth against entitlement. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over the side, fingers tapping against the wood in a rhythm that spoke of impatience, of boredom, of a man who believed this entire process was beneath him. And when his attorney leaned in, whispering urgently, I caught the subtle roll of his eyes, the dismissive shrug, and I felt that flicker of anger rise again, controlled, contained, but present, because I have no tolerance for those who treat justice like a performance staged for their amusement. The file opened with a quiet weight, the paper whispering under my fingers as I turned the first page, and the words stared back at me, stark, unflinching, detailing an incident that had already begun to twist something deep within me. And as I read, I could feel the courtroom fading slightly, my focus narrowing, sharpening, because this was not just another case. This was something darker, something uglier, something that demanded more than routine judgment. A young woman pregnant, alone, working 2 jobs, struggling to survive in a world that rarely offers kindness without cost, her name written in careful ink, her story unfolding in fragments that painted a picture of resilience, of quiet strength, and then the moment, the incident, the act that brought us all here, described in clinical detail, yet carrying an emotional weight that no legal language could ever fully capture. I glanced up slowly, deliberately, my eyes meeting his, and he didn't flinch, not even slightly. Instead, that same smirk lingered, as if he were daring me to find fault, daring me to challenge the version of reality he had constructed around himself. And in that moment, I knew this would not be easy, because arrogance like his does not bend, it does not break easily, it resists, it deflects, it denies. The prosecution began, their voice steady, measured, recounting the events step by step, each detail laid out with precision, the timeline, the location, the witnesses, the footage, and I listened intently, absorbing every word, every pause, every shift in tone, because truth often hides in the spaces between words, in the hesitations, in the emphasis, and as the story unfolded, the atmosphere in the courtroom began to change, the air growing heavier, the silence more charged. He interrupted, "Of course he did," a soft chuckle escaping his lips at a moment that held no humor, shaking his head as if the entire narrative were some elaborate joke. And I felt it then, that sharp, unmistakable surge of anger, controlled, yes, always controlled, but undeniable, and I leaned forward slightly, my voice cutting through the room with quiet authority, reminding him where he was, reminding him that in my courtroom, respect is not optional. His apology was shallow, rehearsed, devoid of sincerity, and I have heard enough apologies in my lifetime to recognize the hollow ones instantly, the ones offered not out of remorse, but out of obligation. And I made a mental note, another one, adding it to the growing list, because every detail matters, every reaction, every expression, every word, or lack thereof. The victim was called to the stand, and when she entered, the contrast was staggering, her steps hesitant, careful, one hand resting protectively over her abdomen, her eyes wide, filled with a mixture of fear and determination. And I felt something shift inside me, something deeper than professional duty, something human, something that reminded me why I chose this path all those years ago. Her voice trembled as she spoke, each word carrying the weight of her experience, her pain, her fear. And I watched her closely, noting the way her hands shook slightly, the way she avoided looking directly at him, the way her breathing faltered when she reached certain parts of her story, and I could feel the courtroom listening, truly listening, the silence no longer empty, but filled with empathy, with tension, with anticipation. He, however, remained unchanged, his expression unmoved, his posture relaxed, as if he were observing a performance rather than hearing the account of a life he had disrupted. And that was the moment something inside me hardened, not emotionally, but morally, because indifference in the face of suffering is something I will never tolerate. Her testimony painted a vivid picture, not just of the incident itself, but of its aftermath, the sleepless nights, the medical complications, the financial strain, the fear that lingered long after the physical pain had subsided. And as she spoke, her voice breaking, recovering, breaking again, I felt the weight of her words settle into the very foundation of that courtroom. The defense attempted to intervene, to redirect, to minimize, but the truth has a way of pushing through even the most carefully constructed barriers, and I allowed her to continue because her voice mattered, her story mattered, and in that moment, more than anything else, justice demanded to be heard. He finally spoke, his tone dismissive, casual, offering excuses that bordered on absurdity, blaming circumstances, misunderstanding, even suggesting that her reaction had been exaggerated, and I listened, every word etched into my mind, every attempt at deflection noted, because I have learned that what a person says in their defense often reveals more than the act itself. And still, no remorse, not even a flicker, not even a moment of genuine reflection, just that same unwavering belief that he would walk away untouched, that his status, his wealth, his name would shield him from consequence. And I felt that anger rise again, stronger this time, pressing against the boundaries of my composure. I leaned back slightly, taking a breath, steadying myself, because this was the moment where judgment must rise above emotion, where clarity must cut through outrage, and I began to speak, slowly, deliberately, my voice carrying the weight of years, of experience, of countless cases that had led me to this exact point. I told him what I had seen, what I had heard, what I had understood, and I watched as that smirk began to falter, just slightly, the first crack in the armor of arrogance, and I continued, my words sharper now, more precise, dismantling his excuses, exposing the flaws, the contradictions, the undeniable truth that no amount of wealth could erase. The courtroom was silent, utterly silent, every eye fixed on the bench, every breath held as I reached the conclusion, the point where words transition into consequence, and I could feel the weight of that decision settle into my chest, heavy, unyielding, but necessary. When I delivered the sentence, I did not rush, I did not soften it, I let every word land, every consequence unfold in full, unfiltered clarity, and I watched as the realization hit him, slowly at first, then all at once, the color draining from his face, his posture stiffening, his confidence collapsing under the weight of reality. He spoke then, desperation creeping into his voice, pleading, bargaining, grasping for anything that might undo what had already been set in motion, but it was too late. Far too late, because justice once decided does not bend to panic. It does not yield to regret born too late. The bailiff stepped forward, firm, unyielding, and as he was led away, his composure shattered completely, the arrogance replaced by fear, by disbelief, by the crushing understanding that for the first time in his life, he was not above the law. Months later, I saw the aftermath, the ripples of that decision extending far beyond that single day. His name no longer spoken with admiration, his influence diminished, his world irrevocably altered. And I thought about the choices that led him there, the moments where he could have chosen differently. The young woman, on the other hand, stood stronger, not unscarred, never unscarred, but resilient, rebuilding, moving forward, her life forever changed, yet not defined solely by what had been done to her, and I felt a quiet sense of respect, of acknowledgement for the strength she had shown. And as I sit here now, reflecting on that case, I am reminded of a truth that has guided me throughout my career, a truth that remains unshaken, unchallenged, unwavering, that justice does not care who you are, where you come from, or how much money you have, because in the end, character is revealed not in comfort, but in consequence. And those who believe they are untouchable often fall the hardest when reality finally reaches them. Even now, long after the echo of that gavel faded into memory, I can still see his face in that final moment before the bailiff's hand closed around his arm, that fragile second where disbelief lingered like a dying ember, where his eyes searched the room as if someone, anyone, would intervene, would remind me of who he was, of who his father was, of the power that had always shielded him. And I remember thinking with a cold, steady clarity that this was the first time in his life that reality had not bent for him, that the invisible walls of privilege had finally collapsed, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, human. And there was something almost surreal about watching that transformation unfold in real time, like witnessing a storm tear through a structure that had never been built to withstand truth. I watched as his lawyer attempted one last desperate appeal, their voice tight, controlled but trembling at the edges, citing technicalities, precedents, possibilities, reaching for anything that might delay the inevitable. And I listened because I always listen. I owe that much to the process, to the system I have sworn to uphold. But even as the words filled the room, I could feel their emptiness, their lack of substance, because no argument, no carefully crafted sentence could erase what had already been proven, what had already been laid bare before this court. And when I responded, my tone was measured, unwavering, final. I left no room for misinterpretation, no space for hope where none belonged. The young man's composure shattered completely then, not in a dramatic outburst, but in something far more telling, his shoulders slumping, his breath uneven, his gaze dropping to the floor, as if he could no longer bear the weight of being seen, truly seen. And I observed him closely, because in moments like these, the truth of a person reveals itself in ways words never can. And what I saw was not remorse, not yet. It was fear, raw, unfiltered fear, the kind that grips those who realize too late that actions have consequences that cannot be undone. The courtroom remained silent as he was led away, that heavy, suffocating silence that follows a moment of irreversible change, and I could feel the collective breath of everyone present, held, suspended, as if the entire room was processing what had just occurred, and I allowed that silence to linger, because silence has power. It forces reflection, it demands acknowledgement, it leaves no room for distraction, and in that stillness, the weight of justice settled fully into place. I remember glancing toward the young woman, her posture still fragile, her hands still trembling slightly. But there was something different now, something subtle yet undeniable, a shift in the way she held herself, a quiet strength beginning to surface beneath the layers of fear and pain. And I felt a sense of something close to relief, not satisfaction, never satisfaction, because no sentence can undo what has been done, but a recognition that, at the very least, she had been heard, truly heard, and that matters more than many realize. Weeks passed, then months, and cases continued to flow through my courtroom as they always do, a constant stream of human conflict, of mistakes, of consequences. But every so often, my thoughts would return to that day, to that young man, to that young woman, to the choices that had brought them both to that moment. And I found myself reflecting more deeply than usual, considering not just the legal aspects, but the human ones, the patterns, the behaviors, the systems that allow such arrogance to grow unchecked until it inevitably collides with reality. I received updates, as I often do in cases of this magnitude, reports that detailed the aftermath, the repercussions, the shifts in circumstance that follow a ruling like the one I delivered, and what I read did not surprise me. His family's influence strained, their reputation tarnished, their attempts to quietly manage the situation failing under the weight of public scrutiny, because there are some actions that cannot be buried, some truths that refuse to remain hidden, no matter how much money is thrown at them. And yet, even in those reports, I searched for something else, something more personal, more human, any indication that he had begun to understand, to truly comprehend the gravity of what he had done. And at first there was nothing, just resistance, denial, attempts to shift blame. But slowly, gradually, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible, but present nonetheless. Moments where the narrative changed, where the language softened, where the defiance gave way to something closer to reflection. The young woman's progress was documented as well, her recovery, both physical and emotional, her efforts to rebuild, to reclaim a sense of normalcy in a life that had been so violently disrupted. And I read those reports with a quiet focus, noting every detail, every step forward, because her journey mattered. Her resilience mattered, and I found a sense of respect growing within me, a recognition of strength that cannot be taught, only lived. I often think about the imbalance that existed in that courtroom, the stark contrast between them, one born into privilege, shielded from consequence, the other navigating a world that offered no such protection. And I am reminded again and again that justice is not about equalizing their circumstances. It is about holding each individual accountable within the framework of the law, ensuring that no one, regardless of status, stands above it. There are nights, even now, where I sit alone in my chambers after the day's proceedings have ended, the quiet settling in around me, and I allow myself a moment of reflection, a moment to revisit the cases that linger, the ones that leave an imprint. And this case, it is one of them, not because it was unique in its facts, but because it so clearly illustrated a truth I have always known, yet am constantly reminded of. And as I look back, as I replay those moments in my mind, the entrance, the arrogance, the testimony, the sentence, the aftermath, I am left with a single, unshakable realization, one that echoes through every decision I make, every word I speak from that bench. That justice is not a privilege reserved for the powerful. It is a responsibility that binds us all. And those who spend their lives believing they are above it often discover far too late that the fall from such heights is not just inevitable, it is absolute. Even now, as I revisit that day in the quiet corners of my mind, I can still hear the faint echo of his voice as he was being taken away, not the confident tone he carried when he first entered my courtroom, but something fractured, something desperate, a voice that no longer commanded attention but begged for it. And I remember how it lingered in the air for a moment before being swallowed by the closing doors, a final hollow reminder that arrogance has an expiration date, and when it expires, it leaves nothing behind but consequences. I have often wondered what he thinks about now, in those long, silent hours where there are no distractions, no admirers, no wealth to cushion reality, only time, endless, unyielding time to reflect, to replay, to confront the version of himself that stood before me that day. And I imagine, perhaps, that the silence he once disrespected has become his greatest teacher, forcing him to face truths he spent his entire life avoiding, truths about accountability, about empathy, about the cost of believing oneself untouchable. And I think of her often more than I think of him, because her story did not end in that courtroom. It continued, quietly, steadily, each day a small act of courage, each step forward a refusal to be defined by what was done to her. And I find a certain strength in that, a reminder that while the law can deliver justice, it is the individual who must carry forward the weight of healing, of rebuilding, of reclaiming a life that was nearly shattered. In the end, when all the files are closed, when the courtroom empties, when the echoes fade and the world moves on, what remains is a simple, unyielding truth that I have come to understand with absolute clarity over the years. That power without character is a ticking clock, and when it finally runs out, it does not just stop. It explodes, leaving behind nothing but the undeniable, inescapable reality that justice, no matter how delayed, always arrives. and when it does not knock.